It is my pleasure to introduce John, who will then introduce Bill.
Good evening. I'm John Churchill, Secretary of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to an event at Williams College, one of nearly 100 visits in the 2014-15 academic year by Phi Beta Kappa Society visiting scholars. Tonight's speaker is Professor William Y. Arms of Cornell University. William Arms is Professor Emeritus of Computing and Information Science at Cornell. Throughout his career, he has been a leader in implementing innovative computing in higher education, including educational computing, computer networks, and digital libraries. Before coming to Cornell, he was Vice President of the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, Vice President at Carnegie Mellon University, where he was in charge of both computing and libraries, and Vice Provost for Computing at Dartmouth College. Prior to this, he was a faculty member at the British Open University, the pioneer of distance education. He's been influential in shaping the National Science Foundation's digital library programs, including the Digital Libraries Initiative and the National Science Digital Library. He holds the BA from the University of Oxford, where he studied at Balliol College, the MSc from the London School of Economics, and the DPhil from the University of Sussex. I give you Professor William Arms.
Thank you, Rick. I must say that I feel very privileged to have the chance of speaking on this anniversary of Phi Beta Kappa. Williams College is, one of the premier educational establishments in the country, in the world. I've never been here before, and everything I've seen today confirms to me what a wonderful place it is and how privileged you all are to be members of this college. I'm slightly embarrassed after Kate's introduction that I should start off with a picture from Dartmouth. It just so happens this is one of my favorite library pictures, okay? And it poses an interesting question. At first glance, this is the Schlesinger English Library at Dartmouth. I used to go there when I was at Dartmouth because it's the only place on campus you could get a really good cup of tea. You could still get a cup of tea. Okay. And it's everything that a library should be. It's these elegant buildings, these nice tables, these studious, I presume students, they're not professional models. They're working away hard. This is it. But notice in the corner here, what is this person doing, sitting there as though he belongs, looking at a computer? Now, the question is, do we actually need all the rest of this paraphernalia, or is that fellow with a computer all that we need for the future? What is the role of a library in a modern university or college? And it's not an easy and obvious question. If I go back, to sort of the years before when I was an undergraduate, it was obvious why we had libraries. It was the only source of most of the materials that we used. And it was obvious what a library was. It was a collection of objects, books, journals, maps, and so forth. And because these objects were bulky, we had buildings, and to organize them, we had professional librarians, and to help people find them, we had reference librarians. When I got to understand libraries better, I realized actually there was quite a lot of technology in the background, but the technology was a servant to the traditional way of doing things. I want to just tell you a little bit about some of that technology. And the reason is libraries were pioneers in the use of technology. In a visit to the National Library of Brazil in Rio de Janeiro, they told me that the second typewriter in Brazil was imported to type catalogue cards, okay? Catalogue cards, amongst the students here, have you ever seen a catalogue card? You know what I'm talking about. It's something historic, For each of the objects, particularly for each of the books collection, there was a card with a little bit of descriptive information. Actually, as a computing person, the technology behind the catalogue was very impressive. The full history of catalogues goes back to the mid-19th century. The modern version, I think you can start with the Anglo-American cataloging rules, standards, technical standards for what you put in those things. And standards are one of the building blocks of modern technology. And the Anglo-American cataloging rules, I use the Anglo-American cataloging rules in my software engineering course at Cornell as an example of how you should write a technical standard. It's how you describe the cards. In 1965, the dawn of computing, Henriette Abraham at the Library of Congress started putting these records on magnetic tape to distribute to other libraries because they're expensive to generate the content. Pioneering computing at a time in which commercial computing believed that there were 26 capital letters in the alphabet. They were putting upper and lower case, diacritics, all the languages of the world on these tapes. Shortly afterwards, Fred Kilgore in Ohio created a shared cataloging system, a big central computing system, so all the libraries of the country, now of the world, can share their cataloging records. Pioneering computing networks, terminals, time transaction processing, and so forth. In the 1980s, we started putting these records online, and I hate to mention Dartmouth again, but I believe that Dartmouth was the first university to put its catalogue online on a campus network. Margaret Otto was the librarian at the time. The thing I want to say was, from a computing point of view, this was pioneering leadership technical. I want to talk about one other pioneering technical thing, information retrieval. And I use it for my example, the National Library of Medicine. Going back to the 19th century, the National Library of Medicine has created an index of medical journals. And in 1964, right at the beginning of modern computing, they started using, putting those records on magnetic tape, and you could formulate a query. I am interested in some medical topic, and once a day they would read all those tapes and give you a list of all the journal articles on that topic. They put it online in 1971, very, very early, and they produced a version in 1996 for web-based searching. This was really advanced technology. And the point I want to make is libraries were ahead technically in processing information on computers. But still, it was very much service. These were support services to the traditional books and journals and so forth. 1990s were a transitional period. As computing technology got better, in the 1990s, it reached a point where you could start doing some things that you couldn't do before. In particular, it became possible to store text, images, digitized books and things like that on computers. It became cheap enough. You didn't have to store things on paper. You could store them on computers. Our local and national networks got to the stage you could start reading these things online, and personal computers were in widespread use, so people actually had devices so they could read things. So the technology got to the stage that people could start thinking of actually building libraries or things that looked a bit like libraries out of computing rather than out of books, paper, and buildings. Oh, and software became available. If we think about putting collections online, this took place over time. The first two disciplines to put their core literature onto computers were, you'd think they were totally different. They were law and classics, particularly Greek. Any idea why these two fields happen to be the leaders? They're very small corpus, exactly. There's not much classical Greek left. I mean, and the core legal corpus is pretty small. And Jerry Rubin, who I worked with in later years, was the Lexis person. The Library of Congress started digitizing large elements of its collection in the 1990s. The Library of Congress, I assume you all know the Library of Congress is the American National Library. It's the biggest library in the world. It's a stodgy, slow-moving, reactionary, and marvelous institution. I have a wonderful, wonderful relationship with people at the Library of Congress, which ranges from wonder to despair, often within 5 minutes. But they've now got a lot of materials online. And instead of having to go to Washington and fight through their bureaucracy and their cumbersome procedures if you want to see their collections, large portions of their collections you just sit here. At the same time, people started creating things in digital formats. Things like reports and government documents are essentially all available now. Reference works like maps and dictionaries and things. And very, very important, though its importance is not yet really penetrating into libraries, has been the emergence of e-books. On a recent plane flight, I just did a rough count of the people I could see, and there were more people reading e-books on tablets and Kindles and things like that than reading magazines and so forth. And finally, there's some very big projects like the Google Books project, which is a private project started by Larry Page of Google, who is a University of Michigan alumnus, to scan millions of books, of old books in library collections. Most important of all of the digitization things that took place in the 1990s was the journals essentially went from being paper items to being electronic items. This is the website of Elsevier, the giant Dutch publisher. Any of those who've ever been involved with library budgets will know that they are a rip-off artist who exploit universities terribly. But what they and the other publishers did during the 1990s technically was marvelous. And nowadays, journal literature is, journals are all published in digital formats, and most of the old issues are digitized. The business model is the publishers store the journals, not the libraries, and the libraries publish these expensive subscriptions for the university. Notice this statement: most scientists and scholars do not need to visit the library for journals, and if the literature you want is journal literature, you never need to physically visit a library. I can't remember when last I visited a library to actually read something in the collections, many years ago. So this all happened in the 1990s and thereabouts. But while libraries and publishers were taking their traditional operations and turning them into computer operations, something else was happening. So if you want a picture of the library of the future, it may look not like the Schlesinger English Library with its cup of tea, but something like this, okay? I assume you know what this is. It's a Google machine room. Actually, it's slightly out of date. This is about a 5-year-old picture. And these are racks and racks and racks and racks and racks of computers. You know, the amount of electricity they use would keep Boston running and so forth. Notice the heading, Beyond the Traditional Library. And I want to run through some of the things that have happened beyond the traditional library. Okay. I talked about librarians. Librarians organizing collections, cataloging them, indexing, and reference librarians helping people find things. Any senior faculty member you meet will tell you happy stories of how at some stage in their career a reference librarian helped them do something that they could not do by themselves. But the whole the techniques of traditional librarianship are based on skilled professionals' understanding of what they're doing. Okay? You may think I'm obsessed by costs, and I do pay a lot of attention to costs. But what's interesting in this context is it's not merely that we can replace the traditional methods by non-traditional methods that are less expensive, but in many, many cases we can replace the traditional methods by automated methods which are much better, and that's a difficult thing to accept. And that the non-traditional methods replace skilled professionals in two ways. One is huge amounts of computer power, and often very simple algorithms, simple methods can often outperform human intelligence. Anything that involves matching patterns, okay, is likely to be better done by computer than by a human being. And the other thing is we found that communities of users, even untrained volunteer users, working as communities can often do better than small numbers of trained professionals. I'll give you a couple examples of communities, and then I'll go back to these computer powered. Okay. The traditional form of publishing released nothing to the outside until it had been through some levels of skilled professionals. Publishers decided what was going to be published, copy editors improved the quality, librarians selected the things, and so forth. So there's several layers of professionals, part of the path of taking things from when you or I wrote them before they appeared where others could read them. And what we've seen is an enormous growth of routes that bypass that traditional path. So one thing is semi-published documents. When I write something, I publish it myself. Stephen puts his lectures up on the web. He doesn't ask permission from a publisher. It doesn't have it copy edited. You just put it up, right? And it's up there half an hour after you give the talk. It doesn't.
2 minutes away right now.
Right. Research results are like that. And they're put up in various places. I haven't mentioned YouTube, but personal departmental websites are very important in my field. Preprint archives are important in other fields. A lot of published materials or semi-published materials go through this slightly non-traditional route, like government documents and reports are just put up by the departments. Then new types of journals, maps, photo archives and things. The important things about this is these things bypass the traditional library. You don't access your YouTube video via a library, you do it directly, and the same goes for government reports and so forth. If you're in the physical science or mathematical sciences, this may be the most important one you use. It's the ePrint archive. It's a nice history, and a fellow called Paul Ginsberg at the Los Alamos National Library some years ago got those of you, I don't know if people here were when I talked to Stephen's class this morning, I talked about the Next computer developed by Steve Jobs. Well, Paul Ginsberg had a Next computer and he wanted to write a program to find out what he could do with his computer. And what he did was he wrote a little system by which physicists, high energy physicists, could send preprints of their articles and he would put them up for other people to read. This has grown into an enormous system whereby in certain disciplines, including physics, major branches of mathematics, computer science are related, when you write a paper, you send the preprint unreviewed, unedited, to the archive at 4 o'clock every afternoon. They mount the papers they've got that day, and their colleagues can start reading them and discussing them and commenting on them and so forth. You then send an email message to a journal and say, oh, my article's there, would you review it? And 18 months later, it appears in the official journal. But the working literature of these fields is this system that bypasses things. Some years ago, we recruited Paul to Cornell, and one of the conditions of his recruitment was that he wouldn't continue to run the archive. And you may notice it's actually now run by the Cornell University Library. At lunchtime, we got into a discussion about the rich universities and colleges, which includes both Williams and Cornell. Should we transfer some of our resources to support others? By running something like this on behalf of the entire physics community and for things out of our own budget is the sort of way that rich organizations can support the entire academic community. Anyway, communities of users. Another wonderful, wonderful example is Wikipedia. This actually is from quantum mechanics, but who here has submitted entries to Wikipedia? I'm disappointed. I would like to see 100% show, at least 100%. I'd like to see 100% show of everybody under the age of 55, anyhow. The point about it is it's a community-written encyclopedia. If you think this definition of Schrödinger's equation is wrong, or it's got a slight mistake in it, anybody who's got a smartphone or a tablet with them can edit it now so that it's correct by the end of the thing. During the election in which Obama was elected president, I was actually logged into Wikipedia watching the changes in his biography in real time as the results were coming in.
The Academy Awards, as soon as the Academy Award was announced, the winners were on Wikipedia.
Oh.
It was amazing.
Oh no, the Obama page was ahead of that. Before he was elected, it was announced that he...
Oh yeah, well they do that too.
Anyway, the point about it is things like Wikipedia drove Encyclopedia Britannica out of business. Encyclopedia Britannica was an absolute pillar of the sort of literature, and in 10 years it went out of business, 5 years it went out of business. Okay, let's move on to this question of computer power as a replacement for human skilled things. And the first example I'm going to give you is selection, okay? Selecting things is a very time-consuming and laborious process. And by the way, it is a very inaccurate thing. Early in my career, I did a study comparing the acquisitions of non-English language materials by Oxford University and Cambridge University libraries. The universities are similar enough that you'd expect them to acquire the same things. But their selection processes were sufficiently different, there was essentially no overlap between them. Okay, you may not recognize this, but if you can read up in the back there, it says Wayback Machine. Does anybody know what the Wayback Machine is? Okay, the Wayback Machine is a fellow called Brewster Kahle. And Brewster Kahle, in his own words, was twice lucky in the NASDAQ lottery, which means that he had startup companies that he sold at high profit. And in 1996, I think it was, he realized that the web was becoming one of the definitive intellectual things of our generation, and nobody was collecting it. It was going out of date. It was being lost for all time. So when I edit my web page, it's gone. So Brewster started, first of all, with streamer tapes in his attic, just collecting everything he could from the web. And since then, approximately once every 2 months, he's collected a complete snapshot of everything he could get on the web. So you see his selection process. Instead of working really hard, as many libraries have done, to say, should we select this? Should we select that? Should we collect this one? Should we collect? He just collects the lot, okay? It's cheaper. It's cheaper for him to have these thousands and thousands of computers than it is to hire people to make decisions, okay? And Brewster is I got one of my three professional heroes. And he's...
What's the commercial benefit to having that backup, please?
Hmm?
Can you please explain the commercial benefit of having that sort of backup, please?
Oh, commercial benefit, absolutely. Suppose, for example, that you take me to court and say, blah, 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 blah. I can turn around and say, blah, 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 you're wrong, and look, because it was on your website yesterday. There's some wonderful, I mean, Brewster's done a lot of special projects. One of the special projects he has done for the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress will identify something, a special time. And the first special time they did was the general election in whenever George II, I call him George I and George II. Some of you may have heard of George III, but that's a bit scary. When there was the election in which George II was elected. They were collecting candidate websites, newspapers, and things like that on an hourly basis, and they got the whole Florida recount. And the way the politicians were changing the stories they were telling the world on an hourly basis. It's a wonderful historic record. Okay, you could, if you're in the business of blackmail, you could make a lot of money. Anyway, the point about it is computer power. Brewster's a supercomputer person, but the real pinnacle of this using advanced algorithms where we used to use people is represented by Google. And I do mean Google. The other internet companies have nothing like the emphasis on this. I remember Larry Page saying that at one stage Google had 84 employees, of whom 14 had PhDs in computer science from either Stanford or Berkeley. Okay? Those 14 to me represent the beginnings of modern librarianship. And their whole thing is done by applying advanced algorithms to things like citation analysis, the page rank system, Bayesian statistics. I thought I would give you the mathematics behind the Google spelling corrector, but I came to the conclusion those of you who are familiar with Bayesian statistics would be bored, and those of you who weren't needed more than 1 minute to do the introduction. But natural language processing, like translation and things like this, what they do is you need huge corpuses, huge bodies. Google makes a publicly available research corpus of 1 trillion word pairs, okay, which from the word, 1 trillion, okay? And that's what they make publicly available. Who knows what they use for themselves? Huge volumes of user data. Every time you click, you see a list of search results and you select number 3, okay? Not number 2. Or you, why did, if they'd tweaked their algorithm, would you have selected number 1 and so forth? And spectacular computer power. To do what they can do in a tenth of a second is mind-boggling. The point about it is that the quality of information retrieval, the quality of text processing that they can do is way beyond anything we can do by hand. If I just use a simple example, searching. I started off by talking about the traditional ways of searching. The catalogue card or the Index Medicus approach. Index started off with a skilled person looking at an item and extracting a description of what that item is, and so-called metadata about the item, and then you search on the metadata. Jerry Salton, who I'm proud to say was in the computer science department at Cornell from about 1968 until his death, started a program of research based on the very simple observation that the content of a textual document can be determined by the words in the document. I mean, that's after all how a human being discovers what something is about. Jerry's brilliance was he started using statistical methods based on vector space theory way back, years before computers had enough power to actually do anything useful. And in a series of spectacular experiments, he developed the underlying principles behind all modern searching. Notice this. Doesn't need librarians to create human beings, to create the catalogue records. It doesn't need librarians or other skilled people to formulate a query. You just take a few words and it finds documents in them. It does require all the text in digital form, and it requires large amounts of computing power. By large amounts of computing power, a laptop like this is plenty, okay? Larry Page and Sergey Brin at Stanford in 1998, when they were graduate students, took this a bit further. And instead of, and they fundamentally, they wrote a wonderful paper about how the value of a document can be predicted from its contents and features such as its relationship to other documents, its usage history, and the reader's previous behavior. It's a really interesting paper, and a very good paper to show to students because it's riddled with mistakes. Okay, there are 2 or 3 horrible, glaring mistakes in it. For that reason, the reviewers rejected it from the first 2 journals they sent it to, and they had to publish it in some minor thing. But it's got some really brilliant ideas in it. And for people starting out on research to understand that the good ideas outweigh the mistakes is very interesting. I use it as a teaching example. Nowadays, people like Google use a group of statistical methods which have the unfortunate name of machine learning to estimate the value of a document to a user from features. Requires all documents in digital form, huge amounts of computing power, and vast amounts of data. Okay? So this is the non-traditional library. And these non-traditional things, which are basically based on huge amounts of computing power and communities of users, have really transformed libraries and librarianship. It doesn't matter what your discipline is. Nowadays, the odds are that you make very heavy use of these non-traditional services. I mentioned Amazon in this context. Early in my career, in fact, the first big thing I did in libraries was to do with interlibrary lending, okay? If your library doesn't have a book or a journal, getting it from another one. Nowadays, if I don't have a book on my shelf, I just buy it from Amazon, okay? It's cheaper than asking the library to get it, usually. So people use these. People use these open access collections and discipline-specific resources, and I mentioned 3 of them already, PubMed, Archive, and Lexis. And in many disciplines, this is the principal source and the primary source of information. Okay, so of course this has been a huge shock to traditional libraries. And my original, when I was trying to come up with a title for this talk, I tried a few possible top titles. Here's one I thought, okay? New libraries on an old foundation. And this really is the theme of libraries at present. This is the Arlington Public Library. I just like it. You know, it's a nice geometric pattern, and it's got this idea of taking the old library and rebuilding it. I think, however, the better title is The Search for a New Identity. What is the new identity of a library? Okay, so if you're starting for a new identity, the first thing you say is, what are your strengths? And the strengths are not hundreds of thousands or millions of moulding books. I think the strengths, first of all, they start off with people. Libraries, library staff, librarians are some of the most dedicated people in universities. And in a way, they believe in the traditions of knowledge and education and scholarly processes more than any other community in a university, with the exception of Phi Beta Kappa, of course. They have excellent buildings. You might say, why do they deserve the excellent buildings? Why shouldn't we take the excellent buildings away? As I said to the Cornell University Library, a good friend of mine, when we were being forced to open a place for our new program off campus, and they were busy building a coffee bar in the library. Why couldn't we have their wonderful building and people go off campus for their coffee? But they have the buildings, okay? They have substantial budgets and often specialized endowment, and they're valued by the senior faculty. These are real assets. How do you use these assets to the benefit of the university? Okay, first thing was library education. During the 1990s, library education became hopelessly out of date. I've emphasized this emphasis on labor-intensive processes that were being supplanted. Library computing had been ahead of mainstream computing. It fell behind. The technical standards were out of date, not we out of date, were out of date. You see, no, I won't edit it here and now, but library schools have out-of-date assumptions about how people use information, and that was been a really serious one. And particularly libraries, library schools, librarians, publishers rejected the new traditional ways of doing things. I was mentioning with some people earlier that I wrote an article at one stage in which I made the statement, I used to use InSpec, which is the indexing service in the physical sciences. Now I use Google, okay? I generated hate mail, of which a typical example was from a librarian at Princeton, dare I say it, who said if this is how little he knows about libraries, he shouldn't be writing about them. To which my answer was, I'm a successful academic. If your users are changing their behavior, you ought to pay attention. But I'm much too polite to say that. But the library schools were out of date. The other time in my career that I generated a large amount of hate mail was when I gave a keynote talk to a conference organized by the J. Paul Getty Trust. And I wrote a rather bland, I thought rather nice abstract, and the program officer said, Bill, this is not why we invited you to do the keynote. What we want is what you say when you're sitting around of an evening with a glass of beer in your hand, okay? And I came back with a real humdinger. And when the Chronicle of Higher Education published a whole-page article on this talk, the headline, on this conference, the headline was a quotation of mine, librarians behave like a medieval guild, which is, I believe, to be a true statement, but it generated a lot of hate mail. I don't know why. I've got admiration for the medieval guilds. Anyway, be that as it may. What were the library schools to do? Well, Columbia University did what I think in many ways was a sensible thing to do. The provost, Jonathan Cole, said, this school is not worthy of the academic standards of Columbia University. The building is more important than the programs, and they closed it down. Fortunately, some other universities saw this new non-traditional way of handling information as an opportunity. I particularly commend Berkeley as being the leader here, and Michigan not far behind. They took their library schools and essentially stripped them out, changed everything. They changed the name, Information School, and emphasized things like computer science and statistics and economics and law and sociology, new curriculums, new degrees, new research areas, and new careers. We've got an information science department at Cornell, which has gone, we're about 10 years old now, and it's one of the most prestigious and highest standing departments on campus. In our short time, we've had 2 MacArthur Fellows, which any department will be proud of. If you measure research by grants, we are one of the top grant receiving departments and so forth. And you'll find our graduates doing things like running the technical areas of Facebook or Google. Unfortunately, none of our people have gone into libraries, but anyway, the new information schools are generating a really high caliber group of people who really taking the lead. The other thing is the libraries have started welcoming some of these new ideas. This, believe it or not, is the Library of Congress, okay? Library of Congress Division of Prints and Photographs has always been the leader in new ideas. They have enormous numbers of photographs. This is from the Bain new collection, where they have thousands and thousands of photographs of which they know very little. They put up a few thousand every week, and on Flickr, and people, you know, write in and say, this photograph is of so-and-so. This comment, by the way, is about my wife, who off of an evening will settle down and find an interesting photograph and spend an hour or two tracking down what it is. Community of users doing these things, okay? So welcoming the new things. Library buildings. Once again, I'm embarrassed. The example I have here is from Dartmouth. When I was at Dartmouth, this corridor, which you may remember, had long row of catalogue cards, these big catalogue things. Now it's, what a wonderful reading area. I think every single person in that picture has a laptop computer, okay? But the library buildings are being transformed and used for other purposes, like group study rooms, computer laboratories, language labs, and general academic space, which every university needs. The library as publisher. This informal publishing, like putting things on personal websites and so forth, is a bit chaotic. And libraries realize that universities need to do these things better, and they've established so-called institutional repositories where people can put their working papers and so forth. And this has been slow getting up momentum, but I think in the long term is really quite important. Here's the Cornell institutional repository. Most research universities have something like this, a place where you can put your working papers, your reports and so forth. Is there something, is there there's one at Williams?
We have one here.
Yeah, and is your experience the same as most of ours, slow in the uptake, but steadily becoming more important?
I think that's accurate.
I think it's a very important part of the long term, though exactly how it's going to work out, I don't know. Okay. Digital preservation. So much of what we do nowadays is creating digital information. This is a project at Stanford University by David Rosenthal and Vicky Reich. David is a very fine computer scientist, and Vicky is a librarian. They happen to be married, which makes them a good partners. Just on the principle, well, lots of copies keep stuff safe. Here's an example which is actually not a library. It's collecting research data, but it's the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, which has been going on forever at the University of Michigan. But it's an example of the things that universities have to collect and keep nowadays. Finally, there's areas which are called things like digital scholarship, e-scholarship, e-science, and so forth. Partnerships in which various units of the university, including libraries, work together. This one I like. It's a recent project of historians from Cornell, members of the library, and software written by my software engineering class. That's why I like it. Marvelous collection of advertisements for runaway slaves. Okay, they've got thousands and thousands and thousands of these advertisements. And the analysis by the historians is enabling them to build up all sorts of trends and demographic and social patterns of slavery in the years before the Civil War. It wouldn't be, the historians couldn't do it by themselves. The historians plus the librarians with technical support, great. E-science, I'm not going to say much about e-science, but it's the equivalent. And the other thing that's happening is experimentation. Libraries have traditionally believed if you bring in something new, you're committed to doing it forever. The idea that you can put up an experimental service, if it becomes popular, you keep it. If it's not popular, if it doesn't work out, you dismantle it. I, for example, am not a great fan of the work behind this, but I am a great enthusiast for the fact that people are trying it. And so there's a feeling of experimentation. Okay, thoughts about the future. Where is this leading? This is the new library at the London School of Economics. I put it up because there's no sign of any books, okay? Is there a book? Ah! Bring out the Photoshop, we can get rid of the books. Okay. Let me make some assumptions. Okay. My first assumption is that academic libraries are still in the early stages of long-term change. I had a big argument with my former colleague, Sarah Thomas, who was Cornell Library, she's now at Harvard, about this word early, okay? Her statement was she hopes not. She hopes that they're over the peak. I believe we're still in the early stages of seeing the impact of these changes. The underlying forces are technology and money, okay? Those are very, very powerful forces. They apply to colleges and to universities as a whole, not just to libraries. They're very powerful. The resistance to change is very great. And my belief is that these underlying forces are so powerful that eventually the resistance to change will evaporate. This prediction, I think the rate of change will be slowest for the leading colleges and universities, is simply because they have been most successful doing what they've done, that they have least incentive to change. Here is my easiest prediction, okay? My easiest prediction is that in certain disciplines, and many of the humanities fall into this, the traditional ways of doing things will remain very important. And that's particularly the case in any discipline where the actual artifact itself, the book or whatever, is of historic interest. This is an interesting book. It's in the Balliol College Library, where I was an undergraduate. It is Boethius's History of Music, which was a set book, that is a textbook at the University of Oxford from the 13th century until the 19th century. So if you ever think your textbooks are out of date, it's also believed to be the earliest book ever given to an Oxford college. Anyway, the prediction is that in humanities and some social sciences and the historical aspects of many disciplines, traditional libraries and traditional services are important and continue to be important. And every library has special collections that sometimes small, sometimes huge. So the role of the national libraries and the great university libraries, and with great university libraries, I mean maybe the top 30 in the world, no more than that. They will keep their very special role as for their wonderful, wonderful historic collections. Okay, next prediction. Notice the word almost that I crossed out. Most scholars and students will rely entirely on digital information, or most scholars and students rely almost entirely on digital information. I can't make up my mind on this, but I ended up crossing it out, okay? I believe that in most disciplines, the electronic information will completely supplant the traditional ones. And that's fundamentally because we're lazy and we don't want to go and collect things. I prepared a course recently while on a sailing trip in Turkey, okay? Everything I wanted was accessible over Wi-Fi from the local cafe, so you could sit there watching the sun go down over the Aegean with your glass of beer in one hand and your laptop computer in the other, doing your library research. That is so much better than the traditional way of doing things, and much quicker and more efficient. Journals are already digital. E-books are coming steadily. I believe the mass digitization will come. And of course, the collections being mass digitized are huge. eventually they'll be much bigger than any single university library has. Even a good college like Williams has only a small fraction of the literature you'd really like to have. There's some big assumptions needed. The copyright law is a mess, okay? The business models have got to be changed. But the fundamental statement is the need for library buildings to store collections will decline or disappear. Okay, let's go. Just a little bit about publishers. Academic publishers have exploited us for too long, okay? Journal prices are disgracefully high. Textbook prices are disgracefully high, and the way they manipulate us is terrible. I believe we will steadily bypass traditional publishers because they've been so beastly to us, okay? That's, because they haven't supported us in the way that I would like to see them support us. Okay, and here are some of the ways they will do it. Distance learning is interesting because with distance learning we have to find ways to support people who can't go to regular libraries. But I believe many of these experiments that I've been talking about are really important. And I think modern colleges and universities require, and I call them academic services, things, and I mentioned spaces for doing studying, educational technology, these digital scholarships, research data and preservation, and ways to publish papers and things. There's a whole collection of things which are, they don't fall naturally anywhere in the organizational structure, but libraries are the places that are showing the initiatives and picking these up. And I think some sort of blend between the library and academic computing organizations providing these services is going to be very, very important for the long-term health of our colleges and universities. In large universities, they may be decentralized. Business school has this one, engineering has this one, natural sciences has this one, and so forth. In a smaller college, a single central service is appropriate. Okay? I have reasons for concern about money. Libraries are expensive, okay? 3 to 5% of a university budget typically. And in the past, the consensus was that this was great value, and therefore all the disciplines supported it. I worry that with the long-term financial pressures on universities, that many of some of the disciplines will show less support when it comes to the budget. And particularly, this doesn't apply so much at Williams, but in a general purpose university, the disciplines with the most money make least use of the traditional library. And in fact, even the physical sciences that applies. So I'm worried that the rich disciplines will be the people who don't support the library. That's my biggest worry. But the reason for optimism is that there's enormous support for libraries. The libraries represent the liberal arts tradition in libraries, and despite all the commercial, the emphasis on professionalism and value for money out of education, there's still enormous support for education, for the support of education and libraries. I was noticing as I was talking that I mentioned a number of people by name. Every one of the people I mentioned by name, apart from Sergey Brin, was somebody who I've known and worked with quite well. And many of them are technical people, computer scientists, nerdy sorts. Every one of them is a passionate supporter of libraries. And I think this is really important. The people who value education and scholarship as liberal arts are the most ardent supporters of libraries. And that's why I'm basically optimistic. My final slide, this picture could be of your new library. Actually, it's the new library at Middlebury College, you may recognize, where my son was. To build an expensive building like this in this day and age is a bold statement by any university or college. To put it on your prime site in your middle of your campus with all your footpaths leading to it is a statement of how they see that library. And I'm going to visit your library tomorrow, but my guess is the message I'll hear is the same message from Middlebury. Middlebury sees this as an academic centre, which also fulfills the traditional functions of the library, but has built a building that doesn't make any firm decision as to how much it's going to be a traditional library and how much it's going to be an academic centre for the university. And if that model works out, then they've put their money, I think, in a good place, and it's going to be good for the college. And I hope very much for other universities will do the same. Okay, I started a bit late and I finished a bit late, but that's what I have to say. Actually, funny thing is, I've got a timer here, so I know exactly how long I spoke for.
11 seconds.
51. I got 51 minutes and 59 seconds.
We are interested.
Okay.
Any questions for our speaker?
I have a question. It has to do with the journal
Yes.
and publications. A lot of times when I want to research a subject, I may go to Google Scholars,
Mhm.
or I may just do a general search, and a lot of times you run into journals that will only show you the abstract
Yep.
and nothing else. And if you want to get the full article, it can be very expensive.
Yes.
as you mentioned.
I told you the publishers exploit us dreadfully.
Yeah, but I also see it going further than that. I feel like it may be an impediment to scientific
It certainly is an impediment.
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, Harold Varmus, who was the director of the National Institutes of Health, lobbied vigorously, saying that if the National Institute of Health, which is the taxpayer, you and me, if we're paying for research, surely we, the taxpayer, should see that research.
Right.
And he made some progress in that area, but is still pushed back. Actually, he's just joined Cornell Medical School, which is great, because to have him and Paul Günzburg at the same university gives us quite a lot of power on these things. But
And as you know, Dr. Arms,
Bill
a lot of
is my
times
name.
When you're researching a subject, you go into the references, and you want to click on
Yes.
the references and collect the references. Within a few minutes, you can really generate, a level of understanding or beginning for a literature search. But if you constantly are creating these barriers, slowed down by the requirement for payments and all that, then you just basically at a
yes,
standstill.
this statement, this problem, which is a very real problem,
Yeah.
is independent of whether you're talking about paper journals or electronic journals. It's just the monopoly pricing of the publishers has given them an opportunity to really,
But you have graduate students, professors, just, interested
Good.
individuals. One example, like the CDC site, lists a bunch of journal articles on autism and vaccines. So as you know, there's a concern out there that autism could be related to vaccines. And it's such a big problem now we have a measles outbreak. One problem leads to another problem because parents won't inoculate their children, so now we have a problem with measles. And it bothered me that if you click on some of those references that the CDC has on their site where they address this issue, the safety of vaccines versus autism, the publisher asks you for payment to get some of those articles. And a lot of the parents are very intelligent and won't vaccinate their children. It's not just the class of parents who aren't educated. In many cases, it's an educated class of parents,
I mean,
and they don't have access to this information.
the fact that information that should be public access is behind very expensive barriers is one of the really worrying. I mean, the fact that our legal information, and we are after all a country that is dominated by the law sometimes, our legal information is a very expensive computer system owned by a Canadian company and a very expensive legal information system owned by a Dutch company. And yet, ignorance of the law is no defense in American law.
So one of the initiatives that we hope gets traction is open access.
Yes.
In which authors take control of copyright,
Right.
the ownership of their information, use alternate sources, use the commercial sources if they'll go along with it, so that we don't have embargoes and delays in publishing.